James on Instagram kicks off our questions. Is Erik Ten Hag a good replacement for Xabi Alonso at Bayer Leverkusen? Andy?
I think he could be. And I realise a lot of people view this from the end of his spell at Manchester United perspective, where I think we learned some stuff about Erik Ten Hag at Manchester United, but really we often really doubled down on what we knew about him already. And I've talked about this before, but the last 6 months at Ajax were difficult. And part of that was due to his allies upstairs not being there anymore, notably Mark Overmars, who obviously, because of his conduct, as we talked about before, Ajax had to fire. But I think it shows how important a functioning structure upstairs is to Ten Hag, as it is to a lot of coaches, so he can just coach. I realise it will be a tricky inter-season for Leverkusen because it looks like Florian Wirtz is going, Jonathan Tah's already going. There are doubts over a few other players, and they will have to make an impact in the transfer market. But I think we have to say, not only is this viewed differently in Germany because Ten Hag's got a lot of credit in the bank there for the work he did at Bayern with both the second team and the first team, and he's widely admired as a good coach. But I do think he will find the structure that he needs at Bayer Leverkusen. They're one of the structurally strongest clubs and the best run clubs that there are, and that has been something that has been hugely useful to Xabi Alonso, as he's just been able to concentrate on pitch stuff. And I feel like Ten Hag will be able to do the same. Like, Leverkusen runs so well, so smoothly, and I think that really helps Ten Hag. I think, Nicky, the interesting thing as well is that, I mean, he's always been in the mix for this job, Ten Hag, for months now, since they've had a pretty good idea that Xabi Alonso's going. And obviously another possibility, and someone who really impressed when they had talks with him, was Cesc Fabregas. Now, of course, with Fabregas deciding he's staying at Como, this kind of paints Ten Hag as second choice, which I'm not sure is the whole picture. But in terms of Ten Hag and the image he has, rightly or wrongly, do you think it's a more logical step for him almost than Fabregas, who has way less experience and no experience of German football, of course? I mean, following Alonso is a really tough job, basically, is my bottom line. And whoever's got to follow him is hard. It takes a brave man to do it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think well, I don't know, because I think really highly of Cesc Fabregas, and I think that maybe he could have walked in there and brought his identity and brought the things that he's trying to be as a football manager and been successful. I don't think it's necessarily that would have been a wrong appointment. But as you say, it's a very different direction to what you're doing with Ten Hag. And I think it was interesting that they announced him as experienced trophy collector in a place where collecting trophies has not always been the thing. Yes, it has been a successful chapter under Xabi Alonso, but Leverkusen's history was very much not about winning things. And I think there's just this thing that happens in football and frankly happens in life, right? Where you have almost like, you can have a completely different reputation and identity in a couple of different places. And there is a very Anglo-centric way of looking at football sometimes, or Premier League-centric way of looking at football sometimes, where Erik Ten Hag is going to be boxed as the person who had a negative experience at Manchester United. But certainly in Germany, he's someone who had, I think, a reasonably successful period at Bayern Munich's second team, who then goes on and wins a lot of things at Ajax. I think there's a completely different perception of who he is. And I think that in that dichotomy, I guess, that you're talking about there, like the choice between Fabregas or Ten Hag, you're facing in two different directions completely. One is, we want to take a bet on another manager who's up and coming, I suppose, like Xabi Alonso was, like someone who's going to bring something fresh and different. Or option number two, I think Ten Hag is the safe pair of hands, is the perception of it. It's the guy who's going to come in, who's one thing's done it before, who can walk in and look after the situation and keep things moving forward. And perhaps that's oversimplifying, but I do think that's kind of the story that Leverkusen are telling, and perhaps the one that will suit Ten Hag to tell as well.
Yeah, staying with the managerial questions, Dexter has got in touch on our YouTube channel, and he asks, with Liverpool giving Johnny Heitinga, who of course is, I think, still currently assistant coach to the first team, permission to speak to Ajax, would he be a good replacement for Francesco Farioli?
It feels all quite safe pair of handsy. Now, of course, before Heitinga ended up at Liverpool, he'd been the assistant coach at Ajax before. He had been caretaker coach at Ajax before. So he's not unfamiliar with the setup or where they are. I think it is quite indicative of the space in which Ajax are existing in at the moment, though, that they can't really go out and get a big name. They just need to go with, when talking about what Nicky was talking about before, someone up and coming to be like a placeholder, and they hope something more. Because I think where Ajax are at the moment and the departure of Farioli is a recognition of relatively limited means at the moment, both in terms of what's in the squad and what they're capable of doing next. Now, we know that a big part of the reason that Farioli went is because he just felt that there wasn't really going to be enough investment in the squad. And that's regardless of whether they won the league or not. You know, that they weren't going to be able to go forward and continue building. And, you know, we talked about Farioli last week, and for a philosophy coach, I think what he did really well is adapt to the reality of where Ajax are at the moment. It's not a high point in Ajax's history. They've not got a team that's capable, either in terms of aptitude or anything else, of being one of the great Ajax sides. They're a long way off that. So really, I think the obvious solution for them is to go back to someone who knows the club intimately, who knows the setup, who knows their pathway to bring young players through, and go back to that, because they can't go out there and spend a lot of money. So they've got to rely on the academy, as they always have. Now, in terms of making money going forward and being in a position where they can make themselves financially strong again, clearly a lot relies on people above Heitinga, but also a lot relies on bringing players through from the academy via young Ajax to the first team, getting them to flourish, and then being able to sell them to big markets. And that has been Ajax's model for a while. But not only will bringing those players through hopefully help the team in the short term, but it will help the club in the long term as well, in terms of being able to generate revenue, which hopefully the Champions League will be able to do for them as well. But I think there's a lot of logic in going for Heitinga now. They haven't been able to hold Farioli.
I think there's another layer I'd add on to what Andy says there as well, which is we haven't seen me or Andy huge amounts of Heitinga as a manager. Of course, he was working with the reserve teams at Ajax, and then he's been a deputy to David Moyes, been a deputy to Slot. He's been doing the work of someone's assistant, someone's understudy at times as well, I think. But what we can take is someone like Slot saying, as he has in interviews, look, this guy really sees football in a very similar way to me. He has the same ideas. He wants to make the same substitutions. That's something that Slot said in the past. So you get some expectation that he's going to want to work with a similar philosophy. And there is at least some, I don't want to overstate it, because again, we haven't seen this guy other than his one brief previous chapter coaching Ajax's first team. We haven't seen a huge amount of him coaching first team football. But if you take Slot at his word, then you're taking the word of someone who has himself talked about being influenced, among others. This is not a one-way thing, but by someone like Roberto De Zerbi. Farioli absolutely has taken ideas from De Zerbi in terms of playing out from the back and from these very fluid formations that can look like one thing when you're playing out from the back and a completely different thing when you've got the ball at the pitch and a completely different thing when you're out of possession. I think that sort of at least ideological continuity on some level in what they're aspiring to do, we can expect to run from one to the next. So in that regard, I might also say potentially a good choice. But for certain, there's a lot more to learn about this guy and that we'll see this season coming up.
There's a lot more to be said about maturity, of course, not just because I'm the oldest person in this conversation, but because Mark on Instagram asks, assuming he wants to continue playing until the World Cup next year, and that ain't a bad assumption to make, where is the most likely destination for Luka Modric after his Real Madrid exit, which, it has to come, it happens to everybody. Oh, and are Rangers... Yes, Glasgow Rangers, really the front runners for his signature. Who wants to kick that one off?
I mean, that would be really something, wouldn't it? Modric at Rangers. I have to say, if you're picking a way to keep yourself in decent condition before the World Cup, I'm not convinced the Scottish Premiership, when he's going to turn 40 on 9th of September, is the best idea. And I'm sure people around him will be telling him that if indeed he does need to be told that. I think he needs somewhere where he can clearly play regularly. I don't think he benefited massively from the amount of games that he played this season. Real Madrid needed Modric more than they thought they would this season. And you got really his most uneven performances in years because he was just required too much. Now, it was funny when Carlo Ancelotti had talked the season before about, he said, Luka is annoyed with me because I'm not picking him that much, and he's right to be annoyed with me. On the other hand, I think you have to say that Ancelotti was using him brilliantly because we know that Modric has been, globally, I think, taking out this season that's just gone, has probably been a better player since he won the Ballon d'Or than he was during or before it. He's been brilliant for Real Madrid in recent years. And I'm not talking about us sitting here and saying, it's Luka Modric, of course he's brilliant. Honestly, I think the way that he has developed his game in his 30s has been extraordinary. That makes me think that he can continue. That's what makes me think that he can make it to the World Cup if indeed he does want to. But I think he needs to be really careful about what he picks, both in terms of physical load and how much the club that he presumably signs for will want from him. I think he needs to be smart about this.
To me, it feels like there's still enough, as you're saying, and there's still enough in him that a Champions League team could have use for him, right? And I think that a Champions League team could use him in a way that I personally think would suit him better, a way that's going to involve letting him not play every game, be relevant in those situations where they want him to. And I think perhaps just play in a role and in a way that is less going to make it all about him and more letting him just be a slightly less assuming piece of the puzzle, but who can just do that work that he does so well, moving the ball on and making things tick in the middle. I don't know exactly where the fit is. To me, just the concept of Luka Modric being on a free makes my brain scream that Beppe Marotta will try and do something to get him to Inter, because Beppe Marotta has never seen a free transfer that he's not interested in. But there is a whole different outcome, which I think is not off the table, which is something like Major League Soccer, go be in America, close to where the World Cup's going to be, play at a slightly more relaxed pace in a different way, I suppose, and just try and keep generally in, I suppose, quote unquote, football shape and be ready for that cup. And there's also undoubtedly going to be the option for him of Saudi Arabia and make a lot of money. So I think there's quite a few options and different directions on the table for him at the moment. I wouldn't, to go back to the original question, I wouldn't think that Rangers is way out in front right now unless there's things that I don't know about the situation, which is possible.
It's funny, my brain screams the Valley. And, I think we can just about fit him in at Charlton. Now that we've been promoted. If you forgot to mention it, don't worry, guys. I don't need your congratulations, yeah? Anyway, this question...
Not the only South London team that got promoted this week.
I know. Well done, you lot. But you didn't say anything about us lot, so if I wouldn't say anything about you lot. That's how it works.
Fair.
This question from Cooper on Instagram. With Sevilla surviving in La Liga by just 1 point, can they get themselves out of their awful predicament ahead of next season? Now, on OTC yesterday, Andy, you suggested that Sevilla are going to be struggling for a few seasons now.
Yeah, I mean, to answer Cooper's question directly and to borrow an answer from the great Tim Vickery, the short answer is no. The long answer is no. Because the club is institutionally in an awful state. I think you look at Jose Maria del Nido Jr., who is hated by the fans, who is really criticised from a distance by his own father, who, of course, was the president of the club before and says he should step aside. You look at the sporting director, Victor Orta, who is obviously left in an impossible situation, but gave a press conference a while ago saying, we could have made 60 million selling players in January. And you think, how? Really? Like, who are you selling? That's the problem, really. They've got no money. The cupboard's bare. There are no real saleable assets. And they're going to have a tiny, tiny budget going into next season. There is no way they can improve, to my mind. So unless you have a situation like the Premier League where you have 3 incredibly weak teams coming up from the Segunda, and we know Levante are promoted already, I'm really struggling to see a situation in which 3 teams are worse than Sevilla going into next season. If you don't have this season's Valladolid, for example, who, again, were a total mess off the pitch, and Ronaldo Nazario has just sold them. It's really hard to see how Sevilla get out of this situation without a complete change in management, outlook, huge investment of a huge injection of cash. It's going to be really, really tough for them. And I saw their last game of the season away at Villarreal, and of course there were some changes made. They're already safe from relegation. They finished, as we were saying in main OTC, 1 point above the drop and 1 place above the drop in the end. And in that last game against Villarreal, who are really showboating, not playing that hard, making a ceremonial occasion of goodbyes to a few big players, including Raul Albiol, and they still cruised home. And if Sevilla go into games next season with a team anywhere near the equivalent of what they put out at the weekend, they're getting relegated. It's that simple.
It just comes back to the leadership, doesn't it, Andy? It's, as you said, like a leadership that will extend a manager's contract after 7 games and then fire him again before the end of the season, and who are constantly making these decisions, it feels like, by the whim, by the seat of their pants, just doing things as they come to them. I think that's never a recipe for longer term success, and it's really hard to see how stability will return until something changes there, much more than something changing on the bench or in terms of the personnel they have available next season anyway.
Gareth has sent us an email in which he asks, with Zinedine Zidane making noises around the France job, is he now nailed on to replace Didier Deschamps after the World Cup?
I feel like he thinks so. I'm not certain. I'm not certain if he's got something that isn't in the public domain yet. But talking about how much he's looking forward to it, and I've been putting my career on hold for this. It does feel very much like if he doesn't already know he's getting it, he's absolutely putting the pressure on and saying, guys, I've been patient about this. I'm here, I'm sitting here waiting. It feels like this is either there's been a conversation or he's trying to force that conversation, because the way he's talking about that job now was very much in that manner of someone who thinks it's their time.
It's so interesting because Zidane is not the most expressive of football personalities. And I think sometimes people take that vacuum and say, well, he's not really a deep thinker about the game, which I don't think is true at all. He's just the opposite of one of these coaches who wants to sit there and talk about my philosophy, which is obviously 95% of coaches. He's just not like that. And so I can't stress enough how significant it is that he came out, as Nicky said, at this event for Adidas this week and said, yeah, I really want it. That's the bluntest that you're ever going to get from Zinedine Zidane. And I think you look at him, and not only has he been waiting for this job for a long time, not only I think would he be perfect for it, because not only does he desperately want it, but I think when you think of him at Real Madrid as a sort of shepherd of superstars, I mean, he seems perfectly set for it. I think France can go to an even greater level. I think you can even argue, and not that this will happen, that France would have a better chance at the World Cup if he was the coach now rather than Didier Deschamps, who I think has overstayed his welcome a little bit.
So this question then from Zoria on X: what can Shakhtar and Ukrainian Premier League fans expect from Arda Turan, and how do you see his tenure playing out? Well, you wrote the book, Andy. We play on.
Yeah, I wrote the book on Shakhtar. I didn't write the book on Arda Turan. Maybe if it goes well, that'll be the follow-up. Hello, by the way, to Zoria, friend of the show. It's a really interesting appointment because Marino Pusic went at the end of this season because, well, Shakhtar didn't win the league and they didn't come anywhere close to winning the league. Dynamo Kyiv won it back with an unbeaten season. And Shakhtar didn't even finish second; they finished third, although they beat Dynamo in the Ukrainian Cup final. So it was inevitable that Pusic was going to go, even though it was quite an emotional farewell, which is at least partly due to the way that Ukrainian football is at the moment. You know, it's an incredibly intense experience, living with each other the whole time, really being in a constant training camp. But I'm really buoyed by the fact that Shakhtar have gone for such an interesting appointment. Now, Shakhtar's strategy has changed a little bit in the last year and a half or so, in that they have gone back to the Brazilian market and started buying players for proper money again. Whereas immediately after Russia's full-scale invasion, in this sort of emergency, how will football carry on sort of period, it was stripped back to a completely Ukrainian side. That was something that allowed Luka Modric to emerge, for example. And now it's something different. Shakhtar are looking a little bit more like Shakhtar, I guess, as they've realised that what's happening at the moment is a long-term situation, unfortunately, and that they've got to build and continue despite that. But Arda Turan is a really interesting coach because it tells us that they want someone who's going to provide fresh impetus. They want a name, that they can attract a name, that they can get someone who has ambitions to make it to the very top of coaching. And as well, we have to say what a good job he's done with Eyüpspor over the last couple of years. Now, this is a tiny club in Istanbul that got promoted to the top flight for the first time. And this season, they were in with a chance of European football for a huge part of the campaign. Now, if it wasn't for a run of 5 successive defeats towards the end of the season, they would have got into European competition, which is amazing when you think of Eyüpspor, a club so small. I think they would you probably have them down as the 6th club in Istanbul, something like that, 6th or 7th. And Arda Turan, with his football, with his coaching, with his personality, has really got them a long way. Now, on one hand, it's a very, very different situation to what he has at Shakhtar, where you have an increasingly young squad over the last couple of years. And even, as I was saying, the Brazilians they've brought in have been young players. It's very different to the squad he had, a very experienced squad at Sport. The players they picked up, especially after promotion. You look at Thiam, who scored a lot of their goals. You look at Emre Baba. Jana came in as well, a famous left back mainly for Fenerbahce over the years, as well as Turkish national team. And you think it's a very different demographic of squad. But having said that, I think the way that he was able to get those experienced players to form a coherent squad, to follow his instructions, and to overachieve for most of this season shows that he's got that real force of personality. They were good to watch as well. They played brave football, which is always a big deal for Shakhtar. They want to play front foot football. So I'm relatively optimistic that he'll get on well there, and I'm really interested to see how they get on in Europe in particular.
It's now time for Game of the Week, brought to you by FotMob. Each week, our experts recommend a game for you to watch at the weekend, and just as importantly, they also suggest the food that we should be having with it. So, Andy, do you want to kick off? What are you going for this week as a Game of the Week?
You're going to have to wait all the way until next Wednesday for mine, as the Nations League gets underway. It's Germany versus Portugal. Now, look, Germany have got this sort of hex over Portugal, really. They've beat them the last 4 times they've played them in big competitions as well. I think we think of the wins, particularly in Euro 2020 4 years ago in Munich, after Portugal had such a good start in that. And of course, you think of the 2014 World Cup win, which really fated both sides' competitions and how it went from there. Germany ended up as winners. Portugal ended up not even getting out of the group, despite having prime, albeit quite injured, Cristiano Ronaldo. So for this to set a tone for a tournament, I think is big, and Portugal will want to bite back. The Nations League has been good to them. They were the first winners of it. It is a big deal to them. Germany are at home and want to continue the feel-good factor of the Julian Nagelsmann run in the Euros last year in another home tournament. So I think this is quite a tough one to call, and there's a lot in it. Look, because Germany have won so much recently, I feel I have to go for some Portuguese food to balance it out. Yeah. And not only because I have a sort of image of David Cartledge over my right shoulder going, don't pick more German food. I won't have it. I think because it's summer, we have to go for something bacalhau based, bacalhau abrash, nice and satisfying. You can eat some of it. You can come back to it when you're still hungry later if you've got a big enough portion. And, Portugal are going to need to sustain themselves for the full 90 minutes if they're to get past Germany.
I'm hedging my bets, but Nicky, I get the sense that you will be able to offer us something equally appetising to eat. So we'll wait for that. Meanwhile, she's done it in the past. So meanwhile, tell us first of all, what would your game of the week be?
Andy's bluffed hard here by not picking the Champions League final, and I'm so tempted to try and come up with something else and just pretend that we're not going to say the Champions League final is game of the week. But clearly, the real game of the week is Paris Saint-Germain against Inter on Saturday night. We've already talked about it on the main show this week. What a final it is. We're looking forward to. There's so much about this matchup that I find absolutely fascinating. Inter have kept more clean sheets than anyone in the competition. Inter have only been behind. I didn't say this in the main show. And I feel like it's one of those stats that's really significant with Inter. They've only been behind in this entire tournament for a total of 16 minutes. And that counts the 6 when they were losing at home in the second leg to Bayern Munich, but actually were still level on the tie. So really, it's not even 16 minutes they've been behind in this entire tournament. So let's not underestimate how big of a challenge is going to be for PSG, but equally, PSG have the highest average FotMob rating across the Champions League this season, and no team has created more big chances than them. No team has missed more big chances than PSG as well. So, as ever, we'll have all our theories about how it'll go, and in the end, it'll come down to who takes their chances. But for me and the meal, Dotun, I mean, I have to take my chance to remember one of the great pre-final meals, as suggested by Dejan Lovren of Marcelo Brozovic for the World Cup, which was... I'm thinking of Brozovic because, of course, he played in the last Inter final. He's not playing in this one. But Dejan Lovren expressed his surprise at watching Brozovic eat 2 kilos of salami, a couple of croissants. All washed down with Coca-Cola. So that's how you get ready for a final, I think. If it's good enough for Marcelo Brozovic, it's got to be good enough for the rest of us.
Yeah, I'm not sure about the Coca-Cola. Let's wash it down with some Beaujolais or, whichever Italian wine you choose to wash it down with.